How did y'all feel working on the project?
I think we had a lot of reservations as undergrad students, and because we knew that there was a certain audience that was going to be reading this book. And so we had a lot of conversations on what was allowed, per se, to be on the website, to be in our annotations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we came to a good consensus about, like you said, like critically looking at these issues. It's not a discussion on our opinions, it's a critical conversation on what is important about this text.
Great. I think, in a short answer, I think I did a lot of circumventing and circumlocution. I'm Southern, so I can't help it. I'm like Faulkner. Just not as good, but like Faulkner. So I kind of loop around with my ideas, but in short, audience, reception, that could have been, audience could have been the one-word answer, but so much depends on the audience, both for Bishop and his time really looking into, it does give us an important context for reading the meanings of the work, and that's the same thing y'all are having to deal with today, is how to represent this material, given a market, an audience that you have as your target, which does kind of it does affect the content and how it's perceived. That's very much true of the original text as well as what you're doing to annotate it.
Did anyone else have reservations about it?
I think that kind of finding the balance between what was appropriate and what was not was an issue that we had too. Just kind of deciding what we should put in and what we should touch on without actually touching on it too much, if that makes sense, to actually focus too much on one issue or one thing that we liked about the text or didn't like about the text, and making sure that we didn't take away from the rest of it, especially with the language in the text as well, just kind of touching on that enough in a critical sense, but not too much to where we took focus off of more important things that were in Bishop's text. So I think that was something that we had to tackle, but that we succeeded in doing, at least in my mind.
Very much so. And there's a lot in there, and even the view of the crackers and the low country blacks in particular, there are unpleasant things that are going on there, but there are also, we have a different sensibility, and when he starts talking about fetishism and Christianity, we might not have the same perspective on that, but it's interesting to see the way sort of comparative religion was working in the 19th century versus today. And those are important contrasts as long as we have the critical mindset.
I was curious about, we've read a lot of American literature as English majors, but this kind of gave us a perspective with the crackers and the Santee Negroes of a culture that I don't see as much represented in the American literature that's, common in, American Literature 101. Do you feel like this is more representative of something we don't see often in American literature?
Yeah, I think so. And part of that has been, again, sort of the audience or the market. These are, I guess, more potentially loaded text that, ironically, therefore are not placed in the canon or as much. But it's something that should be brought in, I think, precisely for those reasons. And it does give, it gives some voice, even though it's kind of ventriloquizing that voice. It does give some voice to low country, poor whites and poor blacks. And I think that's important, particularly here. There is another critic, I love Susan Donaldson, but Jim Peacock, anthropologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, has written this great book called Grounded Globalism, and it's all about that sense of grounding. We know the South is influenced by global transnational forces and always has been. That's the Gullah language, and traditions from coming over from West Africa, often through the Caribbean, winding up down in low country South Carolina, Sea Islands of Georgia, the language itself is such a mix, a creolized language, and their traditions are mixed, voodoo with Catholicism with everything else in between, that it's this global force that's been put together and syncretized. And that's something that I think we see throughout this work, that there's globalism, but it's also very much grounded in the river, ironically, or in the waterways. So it's very local, yet it also has this global transnational scope. So after reading this, I may well teach y'all's version of this, throw it on the American Lit syllabus.
I'm glad to see it up there.
Yeah.
When in terms of Mark Twain's like Huck Finn, and like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness,
Yeah.
Which one of those stories do you think better mirrors Bishop's paper canoe?
Yeah, the Heart of Darkness connection, I noticed on the annotations, and that was really, I find that a more intriguing one, really. Although I guess Twain with the local color movement and all that, it would be closer, but sort of thematically, and I don't know, I find it more interesting to think about this in terms of Heart of Darkness, that he uses a lot of language that sometimes sounds like it could have come out of Conrad, especially with those swamps that have this some Juratical aspect, and they're either Gothic or primitive, and they're from this other time, and that sounds a lot like Conrad. He does get out of it. He comes out to the bright, shiny Charleston at the end of this thing, but he doesn't get lost in there like Kurtz. But there's that. He's always concerned about that he's going to get just overwhelmed by nature and the inhabitants, who in both cases seem to just be almost like forces of nature. They just kind of crop up out of the landscape. So I think that's a really interesting one, with a parallel to make Heart of Darkness, and especially with in terms of the racial context as well. It's very, that some really telling connections could be made there. How did y'all feel about the Heart of Darkness sort of as a shadow text for this?
Well, like you said, the language is, very similar. The dialogue is so very similar between the two.
Mm. Yeah, it really is. That's a very interesting thing, and again gets to the global reach of this. That it's very localized. We know the area. We can take a canoe, maybe not a paper one, but down these same stretches, and yet it connects to Conrad's vision of fictional vision of the Congo. So it's, I think there are a lot of connections there.
We talked a lot in class about Bishop as a carpetbagger and his northern views on the South.
Yes.
Also, something that I thought about was Chestnut's Gooford Grapevine,
Mm-hmm.
and that, the opposite, where the Southerners' negative view of the North. Do you think his depiction of the South and the Southern hospitality is, I guess, the correct representation of what someone from the North to the South would be faced with after the Reconstruction era?
I think for some people, yes, and there is that thread, and I think I sort of missed a question earlier, North versus South, that I could have an opportunity to talk about that. But he is sort of kind of an intellectual carpetbagger or literary carpetbagger here, coming down from the North and selling back these customs and the language forms of these exotic Southern people. So in that way, that might parallel what's going on in Charles Chestnut's text. And Chestnut, it was associated with the local color school at that time, which was hugely popular. But being a black writer and coming out as a black writer at the time in the 1870s, 1880s, and 90s, that was a courageous thing for him to do. And I think the other thing that you mentioned is we could call that the way that language is used by Uncle Julius, the former black slave who stays on the plantation. We see that happening in Bishop's text. That was a reality. Very suspicious of these Yankees coming in, trying to, move in on literally on their territory, and they have a stake on that plantation ground. They work the fields. A lot of them were former slaves or children of former slaves, so that's their land. And that's the point of Uncle Julius's tale in Chestnut's piece. This is, I have a stake in this property, as he's sort of fending off the Ohio carpetbaggers from coming in and just taking over the place. And they ultimately come to terms in that there's a balanced or more balanced relationship between North and South and white and black. But that's in large part because Uncle Julius is able to use the language to his advantage. It's dialect, and it's heavy dialect, but it's pretty accurate according to contemporary standards, the way Chestnut depicts the black Southern linguistics. And he's signifying. He's playing the role of the trickster there. He's telling this wild and crazy tale that ultimately we know isn't true, the carpetbaggers know isn't true, but they get the truer message that, sort of back off, this is my land, we need to come to an agreement. That's the ethical thing to do. If you're going to try to move in here, you need to pay me off a bit. And did y'all see any moments of that, the signifying back against, maybe even despite Bishop's efforts to represent the language, either of the crackers or the blacks in the Low Country? Did y'all pick up anything there?
Yeah, there's a part in there where he misunderstands the dialect.
Yeah.
I think he thinks they're talking about women, where he's really talking about the bends in the river.
Yeah, the winches versus the reaches. And so it's kind of a joke, but it's also the joke's sort of on him. He's expecting it's maybe a play on like Chestnut mythology on the sirens who are going to wreck his ship. But he becomes sort of the butt of that joke. So because he doesn't get the language. And that's white Southern dialect there that he's misunderstanding. There's also a black character who asks him where he's from in the Santee section. And he pretends at least to misunderstand the United States, United States instead of the United States. And where's that? And there might be that play again, sort of, that would be worthy of Chestnut, United States, that they're kind of benighted and backwards, purposefully misunderstanding the language of the Northern white. It's the United States. And he has to explain Grant's government, General Grant's government. And then the black speaker's like, oh, okay, you're okay. You're one of us then. But, even that slippage might be a parody of the black speaker, but I think there is, potential for that twisting of the knife back and signifying against the standard white English and the attitudes.
I think that was kind of interesting is that I think that you would almost expect the Southerners to be upset with this Northern man coming down into their territory, but instead they welcome him into their home, they feed him, they offer him a place to sleep, and they share a bed with him and everything. And I think that was kind of interesting, at least that I found. It was kind of not what I would expect out of reading this text.
Yeah. There's a lot about hospitality here in Southern hospitality, and it seems to work. I noticed you annotated Tony Seshel's work. He's writing a book on Southern hospitality, very much as this cultural formation that he's looking at it as more as a stereotype than an actuality. But in this text, it seems to be an actuality if we believe this is real. Even when he gets to Charleston, he's thinking of just picking up his mail and shooting out of there, but he's greeted with this wonderful Southern hospitality. So at all ends of the social and racial scales, Southern hospitality seems to hold true.
Well, we appreciate you being here today, and we really appreciate your insight on our annotation as well as on Bishop's text.
Yeah, well, thank y'all so much for having me, and I enjoyed the conversation and hope I said something meaningful during all that. But I really appreciate your work on this.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.